Last week, in Kyiv, it was billed as a show of unity. The so-called Coalition of the Willing stood beside President Zelensky and declared no talks with Russia unless a ceasefire began as early as Monday. But that red line has already faded. Missiles are still falling, and now Europe faces growing questions over whether its word still holds weight. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz is facing tough questions over the European Union's credibility after Kyiv's ceasefire deadline passed without action. Speaking in Berlin, Merz emphasized ongoing diplomatic efforts but avoided directly answering whether European leaders had failed to meet their own commitments. Merz said, intensive phone conversations continued over the weekend with Kyiv and Washington, as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky agreed to attend peace talks in Istanbul, despite ongoing Russian attacks.
As far as Ukraine is concerned, we had intensive telephone conversations from Kyiv over the weekend after we returned, including with the American government, and agreed that, despite the continued bombing of Ukraine, Zelensky decided to travel to Istanbul on Thursday and accept Putin's offer to start talks in Istanbul on Thursday. We discussed this with him. We agreed with him to do this. He made the condition that the bombing and attacks on civilian infrastructure and the civilian population in Ukraine would be stopped at least during the talks, or at the start of the talks in Istanbul. I have to tell you honestly that I admire Volodymyr Zelensky's courage in doing this now, despite these very difficult circumstances. But it also shows the seriousness and at the same time the willingness to compromise with which he is prepared to do everything in order to seize the opportunity for a ceasefire and subsequent peace talks in Ukraine. More compromise and more concessions are, I believe, no longer reasonable. It goes to the limits of what can be expected of the entire country. As far as the sanctions are concerned, the European Union is already preparing the next package.
Pressed on whether Europe was losing credibility after failing to meet its own ceasefire condition, Merz sidestepped the question, pivoting instead to financial caution and long-term defense planning.
Also, further access to Russia's financial assets. We are determined. I personally am also determined to get this underway now with all possible consistency and with every conceivable form of cooperation within the European Union. We cannot do this alone. But of course, we will also try to convince the countries that are still hesitating that this is the right way to go. I want to make that very clear once again. The headline is, this war must stop, and that is why we are helping. But we are also helping militarily, and if necessary, we will continue to support Ukraine militarily for many years to come if this war does not stop.
Merz did, however, hint at further EU sanctions on Russia, targeting energy, shadow fleets, and financial assets. But with member states like Hungary hesitant, consensus remains elusive. As Ukraine heads into talks in Istanbul under fire and EU unity remains shaky, the spotlight now turns to whether Europe's leaders can deliver more than just words.